for this reason, he was not killed, but he was arrested and he was chained up and thrown into what was one of the most notorious prisons of the time, a place called the Black Pit of Tehran. And this place wasn't really a prison at all. It was an old underground, disused water tank where the worst of the worst criminals were sent to be locked up and cut off from society. This was a place with no light, with no heat. It was a pitch black, filthy, stench-filled dungeon. And so Bahá'u'lláh was separated from his wife and children and was locked up in this black pit. And this was really with the intention that he would waste away and just be forgotten. And I mentioned a few episodes back that throughout our story, I'm going to read a particular book called God Passes by Shoghi Effendi as a kind of a guide through the story. And so I wanted to share with you a passage in which Shoghi Effendi describes the imprisonment of Bahá'u'lláh as a critical turning point in the story. So Antimo, if you can just put up the next slide, please. So Shoghi Effendi tells us, at a time when the cause of the Bab seemed to be hovering on the brink of extinction, when the hopes and ambitions which animated it had, to all human seeming, been frustrated, when the colossal sacrifices of its unnumbered lovers appeared to have been made in vain, the divine promise enshrined within it was about to be suddenly redeemed. In this most dark and dreadful hour, a new light was about to break in glory on Persia's sombre horizon. And down there, in this black pit, 4 stories underneath the earth, where he lay with his feet in stocks and his neck in chains, Bahá'u'lláh experienced something, a kind of a mystical experience that he later described in his own words. So Antimo, can you put up the next slide, please? He said, during the days I lay in the prison of Tehran, though the galling weight of the chains and the stench-filled air allowed me but little sleep, still in those infrequent moments of slumber, I felt as if something flowed from the crown of my head over my breast, even as a mighty torrent that precipitated itself upon the earth from the summit of a lofty mountain. Every limb of my body would, as a result, be set afire. And this mysterious torrent flowed through him with more and more intensity until eventually it could no longer stay inside him. And there in the darkness of the black pit, that same creative power that had been so astonishing in the writings of the Bab now began pouring out of Bahá'u'lláh, and it was like the bursting of a dam. These poetic verses started flowing out from his tongue with such intensity that he said that no man could bear to hear them. And as he lay there, weighed down by the chains, these verses gushed from his tongue, verse after verse, each one more beautiful than the last, building up like the climax of a great symphony, until suddenly Bahá'u'lláh felt as if the very darkness around him was split open, and he saw a vision so dazzling and so bright and so beautiful that it nearly blinded him. And in that vision, he saw the figure of a woman, a maiden, suspended in the light and calling out to him. So you can put the next slide on. He tells us, while engulfed in tribulations, I heard a most wondrous, a most sweet voice calling above my head. Turning my face, I beheld a maiden, the embodiment of the remembrance of the name of my Lord, suspended in the air before me. So rejoiced was she in her very soul, that her countenance shone with the ornament of the good pleasure of God, and her cheeks glowed with the brightness of the All-Merciful. She was imparting to both my inward and outer being tidings which rejoiced my soul. Pointing with her finger unto my head, she addressed all who are in heaven and all who are on earth, saying, By God, this is the best beloved of the worlds, and yet ye comprehend not. This is the beauty of God amongst you, and the power of his sovereignty within you, could ye but understand. And the maiden turned to Bahá'u'lláh, and she told him that the time was soon coming for him to reveal to the world that he was, and always had been, the one promised by the Báb. He was him whom God will make manifest. And she told him not to be afraid, and promised him that she would inspire him with the same creative power that had inspired the pen of the Báb, and would guide him along a path that would ultimately lead the world to peace. And she said to him the following words. So Antimo, if you can put up the last slide there. She said to him, Grieve thou not for that which hath befallen thee, neither be thou afraid, for thou art in safety. Verily we shall render thee victorious by thyself and by thy pen.
Após a execução do Bábí, seus seguidores continuaram a ser perseguidos até que milhares foram massacrados. E Bahá'u'lláh foi levantada uma falsa acusação sobre ele, até que o mandato de prisão foi emitido.
He was arrested. He was chained, he was beaten, he was made to walk barefooted, and then he was put into a dungeon called Siyáh-Chál. Literally means the black pit.
The place was dark, there was no light, there was one entrance. It was full of filth and unbelievable. I mean, we cannot really get our heads around what that place was like.
Bahá'u'lláh had a heavy chain around his neck. The marks the chain left was evident all his life. Well, you look at that tragedy, you look at that, and your heart breaks. People wait for many, many years for the beloved to appear, and then they do this to him. But he was in the same Siyáh-Chál that Bahá'u'lláh received inspiration from God, that he is the manifestation of God for today.
During the days I lay in the prison of Tehran, though the galling weight of the chains and the stench-filled air allowed me but little sleep, still, in those infrequent moments of slumber, I felt as if something flowed from the crown of my head over my breast, even as a mighty torrent that precipitateth itself upon the earth from the summit of a lofty mountain.
And he said his voice uttered verses that no one could bear at that moment. So there, in that most awful of situations, that moment of light, that moment when the radiance, when the light became manifested in him, it's just a contrast, it's just practically impossible to imagine.
This is the beginnings of, many things to come, and we can see that that's had an effect. The revelation of God has an effect on the whole world, from that point.